Hi guys. This week I want to talk about some very basics of screenwriting. So it's a crafty type episode, but it's some very basic philosophical understanding of story, and a few little tips along the way. These are discussions I've had with people recently. In reality, there is only three basic sorts of stories. That is man versus man. So that is your typical protagonist, antagonist, Batman versus Joker, Superman versus Lex Luthor, The Heat with Al Pacino versus Robert De Niro. That's man versus man. That's the most common sort of story. That's where your antagonist is another human being or a corporation or something which is like a person. The next one is man versus the environment. This would be when someone's trapped in a blizzard or lost at sea. Tom Hanks has a bit of this in Castaway, where he's battling for survival against the environment, having to find water, having to find food, having to set up shelter. He's battling against a non-sentient antagonist. The most important thing about man against an environment is that it's non-sentient. It doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't react against his actions. It is this constant onslaught where he's acting against this constant onslaught. So in a way, the character is sort of passive. So you can't just constantly have that. And if you've got a man versus environment, man versus world type thing, when I say man, you know what I mean. Man, woman, person. It's just the man versus wild type scenario, man being mankind or person kind. In those sorts of stories, even though your character has these insurmountable odds and they're winning little victories, you don't want it to feel like a video game where you level up and go to the next stage and then you do something. It can be a bit episodic. So a bit like writing TV, you have to have your overarching issue, your overarching world problem, then smaller problems which feed into the larger problem, and maybe a problem that goes across through the smaller problem. So it's interlaid to get away from that, this problem, this problem, this problem, this problem. And then occasionally you'll have to break this up with a bit of man versus man, or the last one, man versus self. This is when the person is fighting against something internally. They're battling themselves. And this can also, if we look at Castaway, there's a bit of this in Castaway when he's starting to struggle with loneliness and he's talking to the beach ball and he's just lost and he decides that there's nothing left for him. I mean, he's got an existence. He's losing a lot of weight, admittedly, but he could get better at fishing. He could get, there'll be fruit if he went, searching far enough. There is an existence for him, be it bleak. So he's come to the end of his ability to handle the loneliness. So then he starts fighting against himself. The story becomes man against self. It starts off as man against the environment, becomes man against self, and eventually he escapes. So those are your three basic story types. And it's good if you can identify which one your story is. The reason being is that if you're not 100% clear what is the antagonistic force, your story will feel a bit rudderless. This came about because someone asked a question. Does the movie The Game with Michael Douglas have an antagonist? Because he seems to be fighting against this invisible force that's just doing things to him. And it's the company, and the company is a proxy for a person, so there is an antagonistic force. Spoiler, the movie's like 30 years old. The antagonistic force isn't malevolent in the end. It becomes part of the game. But there is the antagonistic force. It doesn't have to be a single person, but it was man versus man, rather than man versus self, because he did change as part of it. He did become a better person. He did become less of the corporate monster that he was. So you could say it was him against himself, but it wasn't. He wasn't opposing his own goals. So it wasn't man versus self. That was more of the change that the character went through. It was definitely a man versus man, because it wasn't an unthinking environment. It was reacting to him. It was doing things because of him. It was planning. It was plotting. So it was a man versus man story. When you're describing things, this is another quick question. So this is like 2-in-1 episode. Somebody said, do you include race in your descriptions of a character? I would always say yes, because there is, and this is basically brought about from people like me, there is a default white, okay, in most screenplays. America is a large manufacturer of screenplays, and since the largest part of the population is white, they see things through a default white. I see things through a default white because I'm a white guy who has a predominantly white family. There are some Indigenous people in my wife's side of the family, none in mine that I'm aware of. My godchildren are Arabic. I've got Polish in my family. I've got a number of races and ethnicities in my family. But if I think of someone, unless that person has a specific ethnicity for a purpose and that serves the story, my default is white. If I was Vietnamese, my default would probably be Vietnamese. So you put a race in so you can steer the default white away from your story. So for me anyway, if a character doesn't have to be white, I see if I can make them something else. What would serve the purpose of the story? Would it be more interesting if this person had a certain ethnic leaning or a certain ethnic way of looking at it? Because I have goddaughters are Arabic. I know a lot of Arab people. A lot of my friends have come from the Middle East, from where I grew up in Punchbowl. So I understand a lot of their culture, a lot of the ways that guys will think about things, a lot of the ways that the girls will think about things and act. So I can sort of maybe write someone with a little bit of an Arabic twist to their cultural way of thinking about things, the way they behave, the way they act, the way they interact with people is, different. So don't go the default white. So always put, if white is important, put white in. If you want an entirely white, like the movie Suffragette, was set in England, and we knew who all the suffragettes were because they had a register in their club, and they were all white women. So you could either put white or just, they were all suffragettes in England. So the cast was going to be predominantly white. So I would always put race. Some people feel very unusual about putting race into their story. Like, I'll say white guy, 58, bald, likes to shave his head, wears a goatee, tall, carries a bit of weight. Description of me. If I was going to describe a guy I haven't seen for a long time because we don't work together anymore, but Leonard Choice. He was part of the Harlem Ballet. So annoyingly good looking, incredibly fit, black, and never seems to age. These days, I see my Facebook, he's got these really cool looking white dreadlocks. But Lenny, that's the description of Lenny. I just couldn't say, he was a fit dancer. I'd be scared of putting Lenny's race in because he was a black guy from New York. He danced in the Harlem Ballet. So don't be scared of race. It's part of your character. It's part of who people are. Their backgrounds gives them nuance. It gives them a history. To ignore someone's race is to ignore their history and what they can bring to a story and bring to a planet. A rant. As normal, do those things. Thank you. Should always say this. Thank you for watching this video. It's been really good. And until next time, keep writing. Bye, guys.